In the 1960s, two men saw something far beneath the waves they couldn't explain, yet they stuck by their story even when their official testimony was scrubbed from record. This episode takes you through 4 cases of things in the ocean that just can't be explained. And folks, I've saved the best for last. I'm Josh Nanocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. On a hot summer day in July of 1965, a man named Marvin McCamus squeezed his body through the narrow hatch of a small white submersible and began preparing for a descent into one of the deepest and most mysterious places on Earth. McCamus was a 20-year veteran of the United States Navy, where he had served on 8 different submarines. He was a marine electrician and later joined the prestigious Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He was not a man prone to flights of fancy. He was a technician, a professional who understood the sea and the machines that explored it. The machine he was piloting was the DSV Alvin, a marvel of engineering that McCamus himself had developed. And in fact, it was one of the world's first deep-sea submersibles, a 7-meter-long craft capable of diving to nearly 15,000 feet, equipped with mechanical arms and a small viewport for observing the alien world of the abyss. He would later become famous for exploring the wreckage of the Titanic and discovering hydrothermal vents. But on this day, it was still a relatively new piece of technology, and its mission was to explore a place known as the Tongue of the Ocean. This trench is nestled between the islands of New Providence and Andros in the Bahamas. It's a place where the shallow turquoise water suddenly give way to a sheer, dark drop-off, plunging thousands of feet into blackness. Now, as McCamus and his co-pilot, Bill Rainey, sealed the hatch, they knew they were about to become 2 of the only people to have ever witnessed this part of the planet. The descent began. And for hours, the Alvin sank deeper and deeper into the blue, which slowly faded to a murky gray and then to an absolute impenetrable black. The only light came from the submersible's powerful external lamps, which cut through the darkness. And inside the sphere, you could hear the sounds of humming and machinery, and McCamus and Rainey as they chattered about and monitored all the instruments. Now, at 5,000 feet, the pressure outside was immense, enough to crush a lesser vessel like a can. And then they reached the ocean floor, which is a desolate landscape of silt and rock, and they begin to kind of just drift slowly along the edge of a massive crevasse. It was then that McCamus saw something. Out at the very edge of their lights, they noticed movement. And just judging by the way it moved and the size, they knew that it wasn't a fish, and it clearly wasn't a whale. That it was something large and moved with purpose that didn't belong in this crushing, lifeless depth. McCamus killed the thrusters, and the 2 men veered out the viewport. Their faces pressed against the glass, and he angled the lights, and the shape came into focus. What they saw had a thick, powerful body and a neck that was impossibly long, and this small, snake-like head with 2 distinct, intelligent eyes. And it propelled itself through the water, but not with a tail, but with what they could see were these 2 sets of powerful flippers, one at the front and one at the back. What they were staring at was a living dinosaur, a plesiosaur, something that wasn't supposed to exist and was supposed to have vanished many, many years ago. Now, frantically, McCamus and Rainey tried to document what they were seeing. The Alvin was equipped with a camera, but it had a fixed focal point, meaning it was designed to take clear pictures of the ocean floor or objects at a distance, but it couldn't get a sharp image of anything within 15 to 25 feet. Whatever this was, maybe a plesiosaur or something else, it was just too close. So they try to maneuver the Alvin, just trying to get the right distance to get that perfect shot, but it was just too graceful and too fast, as if it understood what they were trying to do, and it turned its neck and kind of gave them one last look, and then with a powerful push, it angled its body upward and swam away. Both men were very shaken and exhilarated with this news. They're like, we need to return to the surface. And so the first thing McCamus did was he grabbed the vessel's wet log, which was the official permanent record of every dive, and he meticulously recorded everything they had seen: the depth, the time, the location, and a detailed description of what it was they saw. For them, it was a very historic moment. I mean, the discovery of a lifetime, and it was now officially on the record. But sometime after the dive, when McCamus went to review his entry in the log, it was gone. The page had been carefully removed. He went to ask his superiors about it, and he was met with silence and stern looks. The official record of their encounter had been deliberately erased by higher authorities. Someone somewhere did not want the world to know what was lurking in the tongue of the ocean. However, McCamus never forgot what he saw, and years later, he would recount the entire event to the author Charles Berlitz, who was writing a book called Without a Trace. Berlitz was very intrigued by McCamus' story, and so he actually showed him a scientific drawing of one. Without even hesitating, he confirmed it. He's like, yeah, that is exactly what both of us saw that day, 5,000 feet beneath the surface. Unfortunately, Marvin McCamus died in 2004, but he maintained his story until the very end. It's a story that makes us question what else is being hidden in the dark, silent depths of our own planet. Years later, McCamus gave a very detailed description of the creature to a researcher named Charles Berlitz. In his 1977 book, Without a Trace, the official first-hand account of McCamus was published. We were down about 5,000 feet, and then I went down into a crevasse about 300 feet deeper under a slight outcrop. We went deeper because the cable we were following spanned the crevasse. It was right there that I spotted it. The first thing I noticed was the movement. I thought we were moving along the cable and checked for drift, but found that the sub was stationary and then it was the object that was moving. It then occurred to me that perhaps it was a utility pole because of its thick shape. I swung the sub in an arc to get a better view along the cable or pole or whatever it was, when I was astonished to see a thick body with flippers, a long neck, a snake-like head with two eyes looking right at us. It looked like a big lizard with flippers. It had two sets of them. Then it swam upwards with its back turned before we could get the cameras angled. They were set to photograph 15 to 25 feet in front of the sub, and the thing had already swum out of the camera angle but was still around. I didn't like the way things were happening, so I came up. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I didn't want to hang around. A colleague of Berlitz, an entomologist named J. Manson Valentine, drew a plesiosaur for McCamus, who told him that's exactly what I saw. McCamus was also interviewed by Richard Greenwell of the ISOC, or International Society of Cryptozoology. However, they stopped publishing before the interview could ever be released. And to give further weight to the story, Carl Schuker even admitted that, with McCamus's credentials, it was one of the most compelling reports of a marine cryptid to exist. That, folks, is what truly lurks beneath. In 1968, a highly experienced commercial diver named Bruce Monnier was on his specially designed 30-foot salvage and diving boat just south of the lighthouse on Great Isaac Cay in Florida. Bruce was based out of Miami and had spent years underwater, both for work and as a recreational underwater photographer. On this day, he was conducting a search along a steep underwater drop-off. So he geared up, he dropped a line into the water that was attached to his boat, and then he himself dropped into the clear water. Now, the plan was for the boat to slowly drag him along, which would allow him to scan the seabed about 40 feet below. And this was a perfect day to do it because the visibility was ideal. It was just another day at the office for Bruce. He was in his environment. And as it pulled him along, he was mostly looking down, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw this large, dark shape drift into his field of view, and he glanced over, and immediately his professional mind categorized it: a big sea turtle. It was about the size of a person and probably weighed over 200 pounds. Now, this is really nothing out of the ordinary, But Bruce, being a very avid photographer in his off hours, was always looking for that perfect shot. And so he thought maybe this turtle was unusually large or had some interesting markings. So while still holding on to the tow line, he angled his body just right and kicked his way a bit deeper, trying to get a good look at this thing. And as he got closer, he could see its body was very consistent with that of a sea turtle. It had the right shape, the right size, but then he starts to notice that there's things that aren't quite like a sea turtle. As he's noticing this, it then turns to face him, but very slow and clumsy-like, and it turned to look directly at Bruce. Immediately, he realized this was not a turtle. While the body was like one, the head was just different. So where the head was, there was a very long neck that Bruce would later estimate was 4 times the length of a human's, protruding straight out from the shell. And at the end of this serpentine neck was a head that looked nothing like any marine animal he had seen. The face was comparable to a monkey's. It had 2 enormous eyes, like human eyes, that had been enlarged, and they seemed perfectly adapted for seeing underwater. They stared at him with what he felt was a genuine intelligence. He was just in total shock at what he was seeing. I mean, it was like something out of a prehistoric nightmare. Think like a plesiosaur, but more with the body of a turtle and the face of a primate. The thing held his gaze for a few seconds, its long neck rotating, and then, as if it was just as startled to see Bruce as he was to see it turned to flee. But it didn't swim away with flippers. Instead, Bruce saw it move with some strange form of propulsion that seemed to come from underneath its body. It shot through the water with incredible speed toward a nearby outcropping of rock and disappeared into a shallow cave. Completely shaken and caught off guard, he just immediately signaled up to the boat to be pulled up. He scrambled back onto the boat. He had no idea what to tell his friends and colleagues. When he later shared his sighting, investigators were, to put it mildly, skeptical. And, they asked him repeatedly if he was sure he hadn't just misidentified a common sea turtle, but Bruce was extremely adamant. He kept telling them, look, I know what one looks like. That was not a turtle. He was convinced he had seen a completely unidentified species. And even now, the identity of what he saw remains a complete mystery. This account, too, was published in the same book as McCandless's plesiosaur sighting, adding further validation that the underwater abominable snowman could be more than just a misidentification. Bruce said this: "We were south of Great Isaac Light, near the drop-off. I was looking at the bottom while I was being trolled along on a line behind a 30-foot boat built especially for diving and salvage work. I could see a sandy bottom at 35 to 40 feet. I was deep enough to see ahead of the boat, and some sort of round turtle or big fish, about 200 pounds, became visible, and I went lower to get a good look. It turned and looked at me at a 20-degree angle. It had a monkey's face with its head protruding out in front, a much longer neck than a turtle, 4 or more times the length of a human neck. It rotated its neck like a snake as it watched me. The eyes were like those of a human but enlarged. It looked like the face of a monkey with adapted eyes for underwater vision. When it got a good look at me, it took off, using some form of propulsion that came from underneath. I think it's some unidentified species. It may be a newly developed one, or a very old one we haven't seen before." One day, sometime between 1961 and 1962, 2 workers, a drilling foreman named Paul Martin and a photographer named Forrest Adrian, were sitting on board a Shell Oil Company ship called the Eureka, which at the time was stationed off the coast of Santa Barbara, California. Their job was to monitor a live feed coming from an underwater robot the company called Mobot. Mobot's job was to roam around the ocean floor looking for new places where Shell could potentially drill for oil. Now, this was not exactly an exciting job, and Paul and Forrest basically just sat there for hours and hours and days and staring at this grainy black and white footage of sand and rocks, but on this day, they were just kind of going about their business, trying to stay awake, and something crept into the frame of the camera. They didn't really think too much of it at first. They're kind of just looking at the shape of the monitor and looking at the things that are appearing in it. And when they see this, they suspect it may be a piece of equipment that possibly fell off the robot, or maybe it's a loose cable floating around. It could be a number of things, but it's not all that interesting. But as they kept looking and staring, it wasn't going away. So they started to look closer, and then they realized it wasn't equipment, that this was some kind of animal, and it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. It was long and thin, maybe 15 feet, but only about 6 inches in diameter. And it was moving in a very distinctive corkscrew motion, spiraling around in the dark water. Now, for over an entire hour, both just watched whatever this was, not really sure what this could be. Despite getting a good look at this thing, they're baffled. And as it turns out, they're not the only ones. When this footage was ultimately shown to marine biologists, they too were completely stumped. And for over 6 decades, scientists have been trying to figure out what this thing was. Now, for some reason, the actual film clip recorded remains classified. We don't know if the government stepped in and said, you can't show that, or if it was Shell Oil Company themselves who decided to hide it. But what we do have are these still images. Now, I know they don't look like much, but again, they have baffled scientists for a very, very long time. Some have speculated that maybe this is a kind of organism where it's a bunch of smaller life forms that have all gathered together for safety and cooperation. They're kind of moving as one, whereas other scientists have put forth more specific theories that maybe they're just different kinds of sea creatures that look similar to jellyfish. But despite all these theories, nobody has been able to say for sure what exactly it was. But there is speculation that maybe this was something totally new. Some scientists believe, however, that what the image shows is an unrecorded species of invertebrate that could have been the inspiration for all these serpent myths and legends we hear about all over the world. It doesn't stop there, because just a few years after, in 1963, divers and biologists who were on this research vessel called the Challenger saw something very similar. The Challenger was out studying this heavily polluted part of the ocean off the coast of Jersey, right near the Sandy Hook Marine Laboratory. It's an area that's referred to as the mud hole. They're very interested in it because despite how very toxic the water was, the area is still teeming with life. And on this day, 2 divers were in a shark cage, and they had been lowered down into the mud pit. And as they're looking around, one of them almost missed it because it was nearly invisible. This diver could see a very distinct transparent shape of this 40-foot long thing that was maybe about 5 inches thick and 8 inches wide, kind of just gliding past them. And the following month, something similar was spotted again in the same area. Scientists suggested that it was probably similar to what was previously cited, that maybe it could have been a Venus girdle, which is this ribbon-shaped type of comb jelly. But if it was that, it would have been by far one of the largest ever recorded. I'd love to hear what you guys think it is down in the comments below. However, its true identity remains a mystery. As promised, I've saved the best story for last. On an autumn day in 1997, a Russian diver named Nikolay was preparing his gear on the shore of the Gulf of Finland, not far from St. Petersburg. Nikolay was a submariner by trade, a man who understood the crushing pressure and profound silence of the deep better than most. But today, he was just an amateur explorer, drawn to the Gulf's murky, brackish waters for the same reasons so many others were. The Gulf of Finland is a unique body of water. It's shallow with an average depth of only about 38 meters, and its water is cold and has very low salinity. Now, this combination creates the perfect condition for preserving things that sink. The Gulf is also a graveyard of shipwrecks and submerged relics. Nikolay, with his scuba gear, he was going to go explore. Now, he waded into the water and began his descent. And as he went deeper, the temperature dropped to a frigid 2 or 3 degrees Celsius, which is around freezing. Visibility was very poor, and his flashlight beam couldn't really do much but just illuminate a blizzard of sediment and debris on the seafloor, methodically scanning the bottom when his light passed over something that made him stop. Because there, Half buried in the silt, jutting up from the seabed was a strange cylinder. It was dull gray and shaped like an oversized cucumber or torpedo, and its surface was caked with marine growth. So he swam closer, getting very excited, and he's thinking that this was just a forgotten torpedo from the war or a sunken submarine. But whatever it was significant, and he decided he was going to bring it to the surface. He surfaced, swam back to the shore, and went to his truck. And he grabbed this long, old, frayed rope, got it in his small boat, motored back out to the spot, dove down again, found the cylinder, and looped one end of the rope around its midsection and tying a tight knot. Then he returned to the surface again, went ashore, and tied the other end of the rope to the tow hitch of his truck. He got in, fired up the engine, and slowly began to pull. The rope went taut, the truck's engine groaned, but the cylinder on the seafloor didn't budge. Strangely, it was completely immobile. So he got really upset. He's like, you know what? I'm going to do what I got to do. He formulated a new plan. If he couldn't bring the object to the surface, he would have to open it up right where it was. He went back to his truck, fetched a heavy pneumatic drill, and for the third time, dove down, positioning right next to this mysterious object with his drill and flashlight. Getting ready, he took a deep breath, aimed the drill bit at the cylinder's outer wall, squeezed the trigger, and went for it. The drill whined as it bit into the metal, and after a moment of resistance, the bit punched through. And immediately, this thick, dark fluid began seeping out of the hole. It was black and viscous, and it formed these inky clouds in the water that kind of just absorbed the light. And he's like, what the heck? Immediately, or almost immediately, the water around him was plunged into darkness. And then he heard this cracking sound. The cylinder's surface was fracturing around the drill hole, and from the rupture, something began to emerge. It was an immense translucent bubble, like a giant egg sac, and it was being propelled out of the cylinder directly toward him. Suspended inside the sac, floating in a dark fluid, was a figure, and it clearly had arms, legs, and a face. It was humanoid. The thing's body was a milky white, and its skin was so pale that it was almost glowing in what little light remained. But its face was eerily human-like, with big black eyes that were unblinking, and as the sack drifted closer, he saw a jagged gash on the thing's back, right where his drill had pierced the cylinder. Black like blood oozed from the wound. He had clearly injured it. Now the sack had stopped just inches from his faceplate, and the thing's deep black pupils just stared into his, and its mouth opened and closed slowly, as if it were trying to speak. And then all of a sudden, its arm shot out from inside, the translucent membrane tore, and clawed fingers clamped around Nicolet's wrist. The talons were so sharp, they punctured right through his dive suit and into his flesh. The sack drifted away in tatters, and the figure was now fully free. It was enormous, at least 8 feet long, with these long, elongated limbs, and it moved with terrifying speed and agility. But of course, during this, it was chaos. His flashlight was tumbling away, the darkness was closing in, and his pneumatic drill was still tethered to his belt. With a surge of adrenaline, he yanked it free, and this thing opened its mouth, revealing rows of thin, needle-like teeth, and it began pulling Nicolet's arm toward its face. Acting on instinct, he jammed the drill bit against the thing's chest and squeezed the trigger, and the drill roared to life. Black blood erupted from its torso, and its grip on his wrist faltered for just a second and then released. Nicolet kicked away with all his might and began a frantic, uncontrolled ascent to the surface. During this time, his consciousness began slipping. The world around him was turning into this blurry tunnel, and his last memory was breaking the surface, gasping for air, and then everything went black. When he awoke, he was lying on the shore, and a group of divers and rescuers were standing over him. They had seen his truck idling by the beach and a strange rope leading out into the water, and they had followed the line and found him floating unconscious. His left arm was bandaged with gauze from a first aid kit, and when he looked at it, he saw a chunk of his flesh was missing, and the wound was surrounded by deep puncture marks. The rope he had used was floating nearby, and it was frayed and snapped. Now, he recounted his experience to everybody, and he was trembling. And as he spoke, he saw some of them, of course, smirking and laughing. They looked at him and flat out told him that his experience was just the result of nitrogen narcosis, which is a state of altered consciousness that can happen to divers, causing hallucinations. Well, disturbingly, Nicolet's story was not an isolated incident. It's eerily similar to many other mysterious encounters that had been documented for decades by the Soviet Union and later Russia. In the summer of 1982, during a Soviet Navy diver training exercise in Lake Baikal, divers reported encountering figures deep underwater, and they were described as being roughly 9 feet with pale human-like bodies wearing silvery suits and spherical helmets, but with no obvious scuba gear. An order was allegedly given to capture one of these, and so 7 armed divers went down with nets, but they were repelled to the surface by a powerful, unseen force. The rapid ascent caused 3 of them to die from the bends. Then there was the quackers phenomenon. Now, throughout the Cold War, Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic and Arctic were tracked by mysterious underwater objects that emitted a strange, quacking sound. These quackers would follow the submarines, evading sonar, and were estimated to move at speeds of up to 400 kilometers per hour. A special commission studied the phenomenon for a decade but could draw no really firm conclusion. The Russian government has since declassified some of its Cold War era files on these sightings, but there was one naval officer that stated 50% of all UFO encounters are somehow connected with oceans. A whole other 15% are with lakes. But is there perhaps a conjoined understanding from all the governments and world leaders that this is something ancient or evil and perhaps hanging out at the bottom of the ocean just waiting to be disturbed? These accounts from the depths of Lake Baikal to the Gulf of Finland are not just scattered sea stories. They are a part of a hidden history. Researchers Paul Stonehill and Philip Mantle have spent years gathering these exact kinds of reports, compiling them in a work titled Russia's USO Secrets: Unidentified Submersible Objects in Russian and International Waters. Their book draws from a trove of declassified documents and insider accounts, revealing that the Soviet and Russian navies never dismissed these events as hallucinations, but instead treated them as serious encounters with an unknown and highly advanced presence in their waters. Nicolet's terrifying ordeal was just another chapter in a much larger, darker story that the military has been secretly documenting all along. One might ask, why would the military put so much effort into covering all of these accounts up? While accounts of beings encountered in the ocean are not exactly commonplace, you'd be surprised at how much water plays a role in general.
Interesting, but we have a lot of professional sailors and military people who are seeing this. A lot of reports, if there is photo evidence or whatever, it's just beginning to come out. Really, it's an interesting concept because people have just started looking at it. They've kind of put it in the back of their mind for years. There's been a lot of cases where things have been connected to large bodies of water. Depending where you go, if you go out into the sea and you stir up certain type of algae, it will luminesce and it creates a light. It's kind of an unexplored area. We haven't really explored the oceans or the seas like we have many other locations. There are instances now where people are seeing craft go into and come out of bodies of water, and nobody's explained that yet.
And if we apply this to something like Bigfoot, for example, it does make sense.
One of the barriers disclosing something extraordinary like the existence of a Bigfoot is the inability to explain it. In other words, if elements of our government know that the Bigfoot exists, and perhaps elements of the scientific community working probably within agencies in the government know that Bigfoot exists, they're not going to announce it to the public because they don't know exactly what it is. They're not going to come out and do that and A, look foolish, and B, potentially be opening the floodgate to a whole lot of other questions and overturning perhaps conceptual norms that could cause all kinds of havoc and distrust in the government. What else do you know? Wait a minute, you've known about this for this long. What else are you hiding from us? Let's say elements of the U.S. government were to come forth and disclose the existence of the Bigfoot, then I think people would axiomatically assume that they're also hiding the evidence for aliens, right? You've been concealing this one all this time, so I think we're just going to go ahead and assume that you got the bodies of gray aliens, Groom Lake or Wright-Patterson or something like that. So it becomes it's enmeshed. It's a very tangled, sticky situation. You're not going to disclose what you cannot explain. And B, you're not going to disclose something that's going to give rise to further distrust of those governmental institutions.
This last segment isn't exactly in the ocean, but it does make you wonder how much the military is dealing with all of this while purposefully keeping the details omitted from the public.
Now, I'm not back, and it was post-World War II, so I believe it was 1956. Part of the requirement is for them to go out and check the area for debris and collect the debris. It's a terrible job. Nobody likes to get stuck with it. Everybody mumbles and grumbles about it. And on that particular night, it was Cunningham and Lovett's turn to go out and do it. They get in the Jeep, they head out, they get so far out, they have to get out and start walking. They're going along with their flashlights looking for debris, and Lovett disappears over a dune or over a small rise. Cunningham assumes that this must be Lovett going off to relieve himself and thinks nothing of it and continues on, but after about 15 minutes, he doesn't come back. Cunningham's thinking, oh, great, I've got this guy that's got lost out there. I'm going to have to go find him. He goes back, and he gets to the point where Lovett had disappeared over the rise. And he hears the screaming, and he's thinking, oh man, Lovett got bit by a rattlesnake, and I got to deal with that in the middle of the night. But when he comes up over the rise, he doesn't see Lovett nursing a rattlesnake bite. He sees something like a saucer with a long, flexible arm extended from the bottom of it that has Lovett by the ankle and is dragging him up into it. And he watches helplessly. He can't do a darn thing about it. And it takes him all the way up in. He runs back to his Jeep, calls into base, tells them the situation, curls up in the floorboard of his Jeep and stays there till somebody comes out to get him. He goes and he checks on, or they go and they look for Lovett. They can't find Lovett anywhere. The first thought is Cunningham had a vendetta against Lovett. He's brought him out here. He's killed him. For 4 days, they interrogated Lovett because they're not believing this whole flexible arm out of a flying saucer's backside story. That's crazy. The problem is when they finally found Lovett, his body was over 10 miles from where he disappeared, from where the Jeep was, from being where they were tracked to having been parked to the time that Cunningham placed the phone call. There is no way that he would have had time to drive the body out there and dump it, much less do the things that they discovered had been done to the body. His eyes had been drilled out. His tongue had been cut out. His genitalia had been removed. Does any of this sound familiar? Does it sound like cattle mutilation to you? It doesn't just happen to cattle.
What Nicolay drilled into that day in the Gulf of Finland remains a mystery. And because you guys made it to the end, I want you to all comment below down in the deep. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.